Hello, everyone. Brad Hairston here. Welcome to Transform Now. My guest today is Alex Roy, an expert in the area of autonomous vehicles. He co-hosts a podcast on this topic called Autonocast. Great name. He's also a consultant, a writer, a publisher, an editor, an entrepreneur, and many, many more things. The profile was pretty impressive, Alex. I'm thrilled to have him on the show to talk about the world of self-driving cars, which really seems to be building momentum. Alex, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks for having me, Brad. Your introduction was very generous. The only thing I would add is that I spent 4 years as an executive with Argo AI, which at one time was from one of the big three autonomous vehicle developers. They shut down 2 years ago, but that was the Ford VW joint venture, and that was very informative. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, Alex, this is a space we have not covered on the podcast, and like yours, we're over 300 episodes, so it's beyond time that we delve into the world of autonomous vehicles. It involves so many of the things that we do talk about a lot, like automation and autonomous automation and AI, and just a variety of things. Regulations. We deal with the regulatory side of automation and technology, and so when I came upon you, you are clearly a bona fide, certified expert in self-driving cars. And, it was about a month and a half ago, I was at an event in Toronto, and I was talking to a gentleman there, and he had just flown in from San Francisco, and he mentioned, I took a self-driving car from Waymo to the airport. And it really shocked me because I've admittedly kind of lost track of this whole space, and it's been an area of interest, but I haven't kept up with it. So I was really surprised to hear that they were operational. And the more I went and looked at it and researched, I'm like, wow, it's not just in San Francisco. There are other locations where these cars are up and running, and not just in a pilot mode. So could you start off by just catching us up on where the industry is today, and are things accelerating at this point, or are they kind of right on track with what you expected? You've been following this space for many years, and as you said, you were a leader in it as well. So give us a state of the union, if you would.
Well, there's no question that it's accelerating. I would argue that it's happening right on time. There are a lot of people who are disappointed and impatient and expect them to have arrived, already. And then there are people who think that it's impossible, it's never going to happen. They're both wrong. There were self-driving vehicles being tested going back to the 80s and 90s. The big sea change, was 2006, 2007 DARPA challenges. There's these government sponsors competitions in the desert where college teams come and have to get their vehicles, from A to B. Subsequent DARPA challenges were sent the vehicles into urban environments. Google hired many of the best engineers from the winning teams, and pretty much all the people who were involved in DARPA challenges back then have a company or work at a self-driving company today. I was always a driving enthusiast. I'm a believer that progress is inevitable. Technology is inevitable. It's only a function of time. But I didn't believe any of this would happen soon or in my lifetime until 2014, when I started paying attention to Tesla. And then Tesla subsequently announced Autopilot, which people thought was self-driving, but is actually a driver assistance system. I drove a Tesla cross country, or I didn't drive it. I sat in the driver's seat, supervising it, and set the first level 2 driver assistance cannonball record cross country. And after that, this is going to happen. So as an angel investor, I began looking at the space and launched my podcast because it seemed like there weren't a lot of podcasts 9 years ago talking about self-driving in a meaningful way. And if there were, they were just talking about Tesla. But I knew there were other companies working on it and started sniffing. In 2019, In 2018, Uber had a crash testing in Tempe, Arizona. And I wrote a column stating that people who think that self-driving will not happen because of this crash are wrong. It's inevitable. But what's not inevitable is that every company working on it will eventually productize and bring a solution to market. And that column was very popular and led to me being recruited by Uber and a few other companies. And of the companies working on self-driving at the time, I had great confidence in Argo AI, which was led by an exceptional leader named Brian Telesky. And he said that almost everyone promising ubiquitous self-driving by 2020 or 2025 was an unserious person. And so I joined the company. Today, Argo is shut down for other reasons, but very clearly, Waymo, which is Google's self-driving unit, is deploying at scale starting months ago. I mean, they've been operating in Phoenix, where I live, for many years. But there are Waymos driving around driverlessly in my neighborhood in front of my apartment every day. And I use them all the time. They are just the first of many companies that will be deploying. And there will be autonomous trucks. They're already being tested in Texas. And there are inklings of progress in China, but it's hard to know what is real or not real over there. So as a driving enthusiast, I love it because of the cliched argument, which is there are a lot of times I don't want to drive or shouldn't be driving. And that's true of everyone I know. And so I love the idea of self-driving as an option. I hate the idea of self-driving mandated. I think we're many decades or never from that second scenario. But I love having the option, and it exists today in a few cities.
Yeah. So how many autonomous vehicle companies are operational right now besides Waymo?
So depends how you define autonomous. One of the biggest problems has been a lack of consistency in the language or how people define these vehicles. Right. So I draw a hard line. I wrote a column. I called my hard line Roy's Razor, which is a customer in the vehicle. It's autonomous or self-driving, whichever one you want to call it. If the customer has to do anything or has any responsibility for what the car is doing, it's not self-driving or autonomous.
Right.
And this is the hard line. This is the line that Tesla is playing both sides today. Because if you have a Tesla, I do, you must sit in the seat and supervise the car. That, to me, that's not self-driving.
Right.
Waymo pulled the safety operators and engineers out of the cars years ago in Arizona. And that's a truly driverless autonomous self-driving vehicle. And so right now in the United States, Waymo is the only robotaxi company that is driverless. There are others that are testing. Motional, which is the Hyundai unit, is testing in Las Vegas. There are vehicles in San Francisco. Cruise, which is the GM unit, was offering driverless rides on a limited basis. They paused that because they had an incident last year. So in terms of actual in the market, in the United States is just one. But I anticipate there'll be others in the next 2 to 3 years. We just don't know for sure because there's no metric like seeing with your own eyes.
Okay. Yeah, the way that Tesla has been positioning themselves is definitely controversial. I've seen a lot of press on that as well. And I know there are many highly publicized deaths of people that really tested that out and got in the back seat of a Tesla and then crashed and burned. I mean, it's you would think they would be very, very careful about the way they market it. But they have their own commercial kind of robo taxi, or I forget what they're calling it, Tesla robo taxi. I think that they were planning to roll out, but haven't yet. Is that still in their plans?
So, I'm both, I have mixed feelings about Tesla. I love the cars. I love them. They're fantastic. And what they've done, and it's quite brilliant, the critics might disagree, is to take common terms like autopilot and self-driving, which were generic terms, and then kind of ungenericize them, make them Tesla brands, and then they became regenericized. So autopilot, which has been available for many years on Teslas, is a driver assistance system. Many people have had too much confidence in what it can do And it seems like most of the crashes that have occurred in Teslas have occurred because of overconfidence in what autopilot offers in terms of safety. And then there's Tesla full self-driving. It's supervised, which is what they had to add to it as a suffix because too many people thought it was self-driving. But full FSD, the fans call it, is still a driver assistance system. And so the conflation of these terms and the misunderstanding about these terms is what has caused most of these Tesla crashes. There are people, really hardcore Tesla fans, who use the system fully aware of its limitations and still crash. And so that is a function of something else. Companies like Waymo, Cruise, Argo, Motional, the serious companies, it's a continuum of seriousness, all had professional training programs for the safety operators in the car. So when they're testing, the people have been trained to a higher level. The Uber crash in 2018 occurred because they were not training the safety operators at the level, say, of Waymo is doing today, or Argo was doing. And so having Teslas on the road being tested by owners who have no professional training is unwise.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, Alex, can you just walk us through the process that's required for these companies to get to the point of being operational? You mentioned there's several that are kind of working their way there, but what does it take? What are the steps that a company has to go to satisfy both state and federal regulators? I assume both of them have some influence or some jurisdiction over self-driving cars. Maybe not, but you can speak to that as well. But I would love to hear what that process looks like.
So there is no one process. Currently, it's a patchwork quilt state to state. And in some states, you can basically just go start testing. States like Florida. And then there are states like California where you have to go through more hoops. To be clear, I don't believe that actually regulations are the limiting factor in self-driving deployment. They are hurdles. They are surmountable.
Right.
The regime for deploying them in Europe is much tougher than in the United States. But regardless of the regulatory framework, there's a deeper problem, which is that most of the companies developing this technology are horrible at marketing. They're just horrible at it. And they have pitted the product of self-driving against the notion of ownership of a vehicle and, freedom and what actually the word autonomy really means. I mean, autonomy is supposed to mean, in the classic definition, freedom of action and choice. And so the branding of vehicles as autonomous, combined with the messaging that's almost 10 years old now of, you will not need to own a car. Every car will be shared. You will be able to summon it on demand. It will be safer than you, better than you, and always available, is not going to sit well with, I'm guessing, at least 45% of the population, and certainly the American population. Personal autonomy and freedom is baked into the fabric of American culture. So even if there were no regulations and autonomous vehicles worked perfectly, the idea that the majority of people, or all of them, would voluntarily give up ownership of the means of transportation is absurd. And this is becoming apparent over time in some of the statements of elected officials who don't just bring skepticism to the safety claims, and that is also a problem, but skepticism to the notion that people will want this. And so there's a continuum of companies in terms of where they position themselves, and some have done so very unwisely. The irony of Tesla, and this is maybe the brilliance of Tesla, is that Elon Musk has specifically claimed that your vehicles will be self-driving and there will be future Teslas with no steering wheel, but also appealed to the notion that Teslas are among the fastest cars on the road, acceleration is incredible, and that they're performance cars. It's the only brand in autonomous vehicles that is both a virtue signaling brand and a vice signaling brand. You can drive it, it's faster than anything, but you also won't need to drive it because it'll be full self-driving. And this appeal straddles the psychology of both camps, as opposed to almost every other company in the space, which is trying to appeal to the notion that you won't have to own a car or drive ever again. And so I don't think the regulations long-term are going to matter, but there's another dimension to the deployment, which is complex. Even if the vehicles work perfectly and there were no regulations, the actual strategy of how to bring them to market is going to vary greatly based on where you are. People say all politics is local, all transportation is local. So in New York City, you've got a great transit system, probably the best in the United States. The replacement of human-driven Ubers by autonomous vehicles, robotaxis, will not make much of a difference to the average New Yorker, because they're rarely riding in taxis unless it's essential. Whereas in a city like, I don't want to say Phoenix, but in Phoenix, if you're a family, you need to own your car because you need to put stuff in the trunk and keep it in the trunk and go place to place. It's unlikely that a shared robotaxi service is going to substitute for a personally owned vehicle in a suburban or rural area. And so companies that are promising the moon and trying to force it down the throats of the market are going to lose a lot of money before shutting down. But companies that play into the psychology of consumers and understand that the market of New York is different from Nashville or Miami, long term, if they had the cash to get there, will try. I'm actually not optimistic about the strategists and business development people in most of these companies, because they're not students of history. And you need to be to deploy technology at scale this way.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I'm just thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking about conversations I've had with friends and family members. When self-driving cars comes up, you hear all those points of view. People like, I don't want to give up my car. I just got, I have a brother-in-law who has a cyber truck, and he is fond of that. And he, I don't think he would be fond of the idea of not being able to drive and take care of that vehicle. And so you hear that. And then you also hear a lot of people reacting to this thing that's been out there for a while, which is self-driving cars are only going to succeed when you remove the human-driven cars from the environment, because that's going to create risk. It's going to create failure. Whereas self-driving cars in and of themselves, if it works, they're not going to have wrecks. They're going to abide by the speed limit and what have you. You said earlier, you're not in favor of mandating self-driving cars or making this, something the government, pushes. Do you envision that at some point the government will be thinking about that when self-driving cars reach some order of magnitude? Are they going to say, well, we're going to designate this highway as self-driving only, just to eliminate that risk, get the human element out of it? Doesn't mean we're going to mandate it totally, but the Dallas North Tollway, which I'm on all the time, is like a Grand Prix. Would they take the Dallas North Tollway and say, you know what, it's self-driving only? Is that a possibility?
Well, in the state of Texas, never. So, look, again, the biggest problem in talking about this technology is that everyone's thinking kind of in a binary fashion. It's going to work perfectly, it will be available everywhere, or it's never going to work and it won't work everywhere. And none of those things are true. There are countries, China is the perfect example, maybe Singapore, where you have monolithic top-down control. There is not much public scrutiny or even awareness or influence over high-level political decisions, where one could see the potential for mandated autonomous vehicles. It's possible. And I think in those places, quite likely. In this country, no. However, one can see the contours of what might happen in a free democracy by what's occurred in parts of Europe. So in certain European capitals, you have congestion pricing, congestion zones. You also have, in order to reduce traffic pollution, alternating days, depending on your license plate number and other factors, to reduce, traffic and congestion. So working backwards from what we've observed, in New York City, there was debate over congestion pricing recently. It was signed and then it was pulled back before deployment. So we have, in one of the most liberal cities in the United States, already seen an attempt to execute a small piece of what would be necessary to do that for autonomous vehicles. On some timeline, I think it's likely we will see mandatory autonomous function in city centers and potentially in certain highway lanes, but it's going to emerge a different way. The perfect vehicle for me is actually two vehicles. It's a bicycle, because there are things a bicycle could do better than any car ever will, and I'm always going to own one. I'm not opposed to shared bikes, but I love owning them. And then the second vehicle is a car, but it's a dual mode car. It's a car I own that is also capable of driverless function. Because in the future, I anticipate that when every vehicle is capable of driverless function and we can own them, then having a mandatory autonomy mode in the city center is no problem, even for the most rabid, red meat-eating American there is, because I would love to be able to drive into downtown Manhattan in my car, and then when I pass the boundary and I enter the island in my car, I don't have to drive, but it's mine. Whatever that costs, I'll pay for it. I don't care. That's what I want. And that's what a lot of people want. It's why the congestion pricing in New York was repealed. The pressure from voters who want to drive their cars in the city was too high, and they could not come up with a financial or economic, scheme or regime that would enable that to occur such that everyone was satisfied. But adding driverless functionality to cars we own is the unlock, which enables that potential to be acceptable to every American as opposed to just some. The second part, it comes back to ownership. You will never convince at least 45% of Americans to give up the cars they own, ever. But give them something that makes their lives better with the cars they do own, and they will happily take it.
Yeah, that's really an interesting perspective. And I can think of times when I would really appreciate having a self-driving feature. Maybe I'm in a very heavy traffic and I don't want to be sitting there just edging forward, every few seconds, and because that drives me crazy and I'd rather be in the back working on something. There's other times when I think the obsessive compulsive side of me really wants to be driving because I want to get somewhere a little faster. And I know that's going to push the limits of a self-driving car because it's going to go slower and be more safe and those types of things. But yeah, that's an interesting perspective you have. Something else that I would love to hear your thoughts on it's around the ethical kind of considerations of self-driving cars. And I think back, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago, there was a 60 Minutes episode. You'll probably remember this, but it was focused on self-driving cars. And they interviewed a professor from Carnegie Mellon who had
was it Philip Kootman?
I can't remember the name, but if he was the authority on self-driving, that probably was him. But they were interviewing him, and he was talking about just how far things have come and how this will be the future. And they started asking him, like, what are some of the big hurdles that you have to get over? And he actually went into this whole ethical topic and said, we don't just have to have a car that can drive on its own and obey this traffic, regulations and avoid other cars and things like that. But we have to build into it some type of decision-making capability that is ethical. And he used as an example, what if the car sees someone immediately run across the road? Is it going to try to do everything in its power to avoid that person, or is it going to try to save and preserve the life of the passenger? Which of those two is? And it was an unfair question, even at the time. I thought, man, that's a really tough one. But that's the question that was asked: is how do you do that, and how do you guys figure that out? And the professor handled it pretty well. But I think he said, look, decision making is imperfect, but we've got to build a car that can make good decisions. We're not going to try to build in some form of benevolence or anything like that, because we don't, it ultimately is just trying to get people from point A to point B. And there's an incredible number of things that could happen that we can't anticipate. So it was an interesting discussion, but what are your thoughts on that? Is that something that was made, was kind of exacerbated because of 60 Minutes, or is that really something that self-driving cars companies have to grapple with?
Well, I'll say what the self-driving car companies don't want to say, because it wouldn't be a good look, but I'm happy to say it. There is no such thing as the trolley problem, which is what you're describing. It doesn't exist in the real world. There is a trolley solution. The trolley problem, as vehicles, a thought experiment, trains go down the tracks. There's a group of newborn babies in one one of the tracks, and the other one is all the members of your family and a group of nuns. And which one do you hit because your brakes have failed? Well, the answer is the trolley solution is your trolley was poorly designed and it didn't have a redundant braking system. If one faces two bad choices, the mistake has already been made, and it's and game over. When a vehicle, any vehicle, a bicycle, a human-driven car, an autonomous vehicle, leaves its parking spot, the chances of something bad happening are non-zero. Will be true till the end of history. So the only solution is to build in as many potential safeguards into the system to mitigate and prevent the overwhelming majority of predictable problems. A real ethical problem is that we hand out driver's licenses in this country without suitable training, let alone education about how to maintain your vehicle. So think about all the things that happen when a human is confronted with the two bad scenarios. They see a group of nuns and newborn babies. They have to choose. So first, they have to be paying attention. Most people are not. They're on their phones. They're distracted. And then if they see the problem, they have to make a decision. One of the other worries are a third option. Assuming they're capable of making a decision, which few people, unless they are highly trained professional race car drivers, can do it at any speed, they then have to execute the decision and hit the right pedal. Most people won't. That's why we have unintended acceleration crashes. So let's assume they do hit the correct pedal. Then they also have to turn the right amount of steering input. Will they do that? Unlikely. And assuming they've done all those things, their tire pressure is correct, they have sufficient grip or lack of grip, and the average person will get all five of these things wrong before confronting the problem. They don't have the skills or attention or maintenance of the vehicle. Now, when I was in the business at Argo, every vehicle before leaving the depot was checked and double checked for every single potential thing that could go wrong. So worst case scenario, it will work as designed. So now the hardware is designed, the vehicle leaves the depot. It is operating at speeds that it believes it can stop or steer away from almost any potential scenario. The scenarios that no company and no driver could ever account for are the child or dog running out in front of the vehicle at a distance of 5 feet. No vehicle, not a bicycle ridden by a professional cyclist, could stop in time. So these are unfair, bad faith questions to ask, because what we have today is no better, and without question, worse than what autonomous vehicles will be capable of in the future. When an autonomous vehicle, at least at Argo where I was, when it encountered a potential collision with a near distance object or child or whatever, it would apply maximum braking instantly. Few people are capable of that today. So given 100+ years of experience with human drivers, we already know how good and bad human drivers can be. The only question is how long it will take before autonomous vehicles can demonstrably, with sufficient metrics to convince anyone, match and surpass human drivers in all scenarios. I'm absolutely convinced, based on riding Waymos almost every day, that in simpler and maybe average scenarios in Phoenix, they're already better. And in time, they'll be better in more complex scenarios of bad weather. And then this will be laughed off as something we couldn't believe we have. It is right to ask it, to force discussion, but it is not a real problem.
Okay. I'd like to focus for a second on just the integration of all the AI technologies that are at the center of self-driving cars. And we talk a lot about AI on this program. Have we, from your perspective, have there been any like big advancements or aha moments with AI in the last 3, 4, 5 years that have really propelled self-driving cars forward, or has the technology been there for some time and it's just been a matter of working out, kind of the minor details? I mean, AI especially with generative AI, we're in a whole different era of that. I know that really probably hasn't had much bearing on self-driving cars, but just in general, I'm curious about how that has evolved. And, as you've tracked it, because you've been in it for so long, what does that evolution look like? And can you summarize that in some way for our audience? That would be interesting, I think.
I generally say that if you want to understand artificial intelligence, then take any article about it or question and substitute the word electricity and imagine yourself in 1900. Because electricity, can be used for good or evil. It can work or not work. Power goes out, you don't have it. The most, I think, applicable historical example would be a discussion of the current wars, which occurred in the late 19th century, which was the war between Edison and Westinghouse for which type of electricity would be productized and ubiquitous. And that was the war between alternating current and direct current. And whomever won would both control the business, and also it would change the landscape and layout of cities, because alternating current, direct current required power plants, different locations to transmit over distance or not. So the most analogous thing in terms of artificial intelligence, self-driving, we've had primitive forms of artificial intelligence, so it's a broad term, primitive forms of logic built into cars going back to the 80s. Automatic emergency braking, senses, lack of grip, and then modulates the brakes to give the driver more control over where their vehicle is going while slowing down. That is a very primitive form of intelligence, very primitive. Moving up, you have traction control and dynamic stability control, and then the addition of lane keeping. And so the sum of all these smaller technologies comprises a very primitive form of intelligence built into cars we've had for decades. It is an era of self-driving. There is a debate over whether one can build a driverless vehicle with hard-coded, human hand-coded logic. The argument for it is that you can look at a neighbor and say, here's all the things that could happen here. These are the people who live here. Here's where the kids wear. And you had enough time and money, you could hard code the logic to drive through a neighborhood. But that is very difficult and expensive to scale, because you could never hand code the logic to drive everywhere, anytime, everywhere in the world. And so the other approach, I guess what's called end-to-end neural nets, would be vehicles that just drive around with cameras, observe the world as it is, and then learn from patterns in the world how to drive anywhere. The logic is that it's cheaper, and eventually, with enough driving, you will learn enough. And then there are companies that do a little bit of both. So companies like Waymo, Argo, Cruise generally do a combination, but lean towards the first one. Over time, move more to the center, and eventually, I think we'll move more to the right. And then companies like Tesla are all the way on the right. They think that they can do end-to-end neural net learning. So let me add that I'm not an AI engineer, but I'm familiar enough with the two approaches to make this statement. If your ODD, which is an operational design domain, that is the area, time, space, and conditions in which you can operate, is sufficiently small, then the first approach can absolutely work sooner. And if your goal is to drive the entire world, then the second approach is probably the better one. But like boiling the ocean with the tea kettle, it's going to take a long time. So these debates, again, are not really important because today no one cares what kind of electricity is coming out of a socket to power your devices. We only care that it works. And both these approaches will eventually bring us products. We already have Waymo in the field today, and they're doing a combination, and it works brilliantly. When the Tesla fans claim that no one else can generalize and deploy a service, what they're really saying is they don't believe that Waymo can scale profitably using their approach. But Waymo's in the market today with a product, and Tesla is not. And so these debates will be lost to time, and it just doesn't matter. One last word about LLMs. LLMs have emerged recently with something new, which is valuable. A company called Wave out of the UK, doing an end-to-end neural net approach, has claimed that one will be able to ask their system why it did what it did, which is not always something that's easy to derive an answer to. And in systems that are very, very complex, it is hard to know unless one is working on the system and at the company, what has happened and why. And so that is an interesting feature. It has some value potentially to both researchers and regulators. But again, in time, it won't matter because all that will matter is that a product functions, people trust it. And trust is a lot harder to come by, and it's not a science, it's an art.
Okay. Well, one thing we know self-driving cars have is cameras, so they can see what's around them and what's in front of them and behind them. I found it interesting and humorous, the story about the woman recently who was very anti-self-driving car, and she was vandalizing, I think it was Waymo. She was vandalizing Waymo, and it took authorities like 20 seconds, to find her because she's on film in each of them. But so we know they have those for sure. But Alex, so talked about a lot of different topics here, all fascinating to me. When you're talking to someone and self-driving cars comes out and you want to describe your point of view on what you think are like the big picture societal benefits of autonomous vehicles, going forward in the future. Well, today as well, but going forward when it becomes much more pervasive, what do you say to that person? I'm just curious to hear how you frame it out.
That's it's great. I love it. Like, what's not to love? Most of the time, driving sucks. Commuting sucks. Unless one is driving alone on the mountain road in a great car, driving sucks. It's work. Who wants to do more work unless they're being paid? No one's paying me to drive my car in traffic. It sucks. So one reason not to like it is because someone is trying to sell you something else, which is a lack of choice, a lack of freedom. The most autonomous vehicle ever made, it's a Jeep Wrangler, because you can drive it anywhere whenever you feel like it, and it's pretty tough machine. And so the only thing that will make that any better is if it has a self-driving function, so it can take you from home to the mountain, and then you can drive it. That is it. And the way car companies and autonomous vehicle developers have been marketing any kind of automation is completely backwards. If you think about kind of the cliched BMW driver, and I own an old BMW, and I set a cannonball record in it. I love that car. It had traction control built into the car, and you could turn it off, but it wasn't really on. And BMW drivers back in the day would complain, well, I can't do donuts, I can't drift because I can't really turn the traction control on. Today, the modern version of that are driver assistance systems that let you take your hands off the wheel on the highway. Ford, Cadillac have great systems. Other companies have mediocre systems. But all of these systems had, I don't want to say it's a flaw, but it's not a mistake. They're deliberate about it. They have a camera in the vehicle that looks at your eyes, a driver monitoring system. The system, if you engage the hands-free function, will only stay engaged as long as your eyes are on the road. If you look away, the system will disengage, and now you have to put your hand in the back of the wheel and drive it. This is absolutely the opposite of what customers actually want. Now, there are some benefits to these systems because it reduces your stress and fatigue on the long highway drives. But if you think about what people really want or what they need to make vehicles safer with automation, is a system that you're driving, you get tired or you're drunk, and the camera sees that. And as soon as you are too tired or drunk to drive, the automation turns on. That's the opposite of how all the systems are designed.
Yeah.
Right now, there's no car on the road today that activates the maximum safety features because the camera saw that you weren't paying attention. And so we have a fundamental, there's a fork in the road coming about how these systems will be designed. Because what I really want, and no one is offering this today, is a system similar to what goes into Airbus and not Boeing. But Airbus has a system called the Flight Envelope Protection System. So the pilot can do whatever he wants with the control sticks, but the system will not allow the plane to move out of the optimal safe pitch, roll, and yaw. The equivalent to that in a car would be, I'm driving fast, I'm alone on a mountain road, I make a mistake and I'm about to steer off the cliff or into a group of kids, and the car turns back and keeps me on the road. We are nowhere near such a system. It requires a complete rethink of how driver assistance and automation is deployed in cars with steering wheels. Toyota has announced a system called Guardian, which is the closest thing we've seen conceptually to an Airbus type system. But I don't think it's near commercialization. I wish it was. And that is the future of sports cars, because the best sports car is one I can drive as fast as I want that won't let me destroy it or hurt anyone else. But there is no catharsis to owning a sports car unless there are consequences to a mistake. And in time, technology and culture will have to meet and have that debate. Because we want those consequences to occur at no cost to anyone outside the car. And that is for some point in the future. I'm thrilled for that to happen. We need to have that debate.
That's a great answer. Here I was expecting you to say about, we're going to reduce accidents and deaths, and the answer is driving sucks. I agree with that.
I mean, let me add that, if autonomous vehicles were only as safe as people today, they would still have value. They would still have value. They could be, that means for sure. And then beyond that they are safer is, well, I would like to say table stakes for the companies that promise they will be. But that is up to the companies to prove. I'm not sure ultimately it matters, because from 1920s through the 1970s, commercial aviation had a lot of crashes. And yet the market grew because people were getting access to something which profoundly increased their freedom. And there was risk. They were happy to take those risks. And commercial aviation crashes were front page news every time. Did not slow down people buying plane tickets. And in the 70s, after a few really big crashes, there were 747s, I think it was the Canary Islands, hundreds were killed. After that, we saw some radical changes in how flight crews manage decision-making. And so I imagine in time that autonomous vehicles will be both safer than the average person, and many generations of kids will age into taking autonomous vehicles for granted. My daughter's 5. She already thinks they're completely normal. She never asked about its safety at all. And she does say all the time that her mother is safer than I am as a driver, a better driver than I am. But she assumes that Mr. Robotaxi is fine. And so I believe that we will culturally age into self-driving trusted ubiquity before the critics of safety get an answer that satisfies them.
do you think the success of autonomous cars is going to basically lay the foundation for air taxis or whatever you want to call them? I mean, that's another space that's been interesting. Uber was going hard at that for a while. I know they sold off their Uber Elevate business to another company back in the pandemic, but there would seem to be some correlation there. I know when you get into the air, now you have a whole nother government entity that's probably more high strung than anything that happens at the state level with cars. But what do you think? Is there a connection there?
Well, I mean, we do have multiple companies building, electric vertical takeoff and landing craft today, testing. I've ridden in some of them. Again, it's inevitable. The question is whether or not the companies doing so will find, I want to say product market fit. There's obviously a market for it, but the noise levels for these would have to come down before they will be allowable over dense urban areas. That's number one. I mean, I am assuming that the safety issues can be resolved. So beyond that, the noise levels will be an issue. We have decades of friction between neighborhoods and cities and airports because of noise levels. And certain types of aircraft are not allowed because of noise. So assuming the safety is solvable, it is on some timeline, that's the next friction point. And once that's solved, then that market will develop, undoubtedly. I imagine we'll see more of this in parts of the Middle East and in monolithic countries with top-down control before we see it over Los Angeles, but it will happen. And of course, for people who live in rural areas, who have their compound and friends to see, this is going to be a great and fun product. I go to a conference every year called the Up Summit, which is a venture capital firm that's invested in a wide variety of transportation. And every year they bring eVTOLs. You can fly around at their event in Texas. Sure. And I mean, honestly, it's...
Yeah, it was. I saw at the recent Paris Olympics, they were trying to put those in play, and I think at the very last minute, they just couldn't get all the state and local and safety personnel to agree that this was a risk worth taking. So instead, they had one flying above with nobody in it. So kind of anticlimactic, but that's interesting to hear that we might be building momentum there as well.
Well, the funny thing about AI and all automation is the values of the people building it are the values of the system. So, the decision to go from, 2 safety operators to 1 to none, and where you make that decision, these are human decisions. AI doesn't make those decisions. And so, last year when Cruise had crashed in San Francisco, actually going back to before the Cruise crash, there was some news stories about people putting cones on the hoods of these Cruise vehicles and Waymo vehicles. Nobody thought, you didn't need to build an artificial intelligence and run simulation to know that in a city like San Francisco, there are going to be people who will vandalize literally anything they see, especially if it's new, especially if it comes out of a well-funded Silicon Valley firm. If I was 15 years old in San Francisco, I would have put the cone in the car just for fun. But that would not happen in probably a Texas city or a Florida city, because culturally those places are different. Nobody in the $10 billion funded company with the AI and self-driving cars even thought about that. Waymo didn't complain, but the Cruise folks were like, I can't believe this is happening. Right. So,
No, I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that I read your LinkedIn profile, and it really did make my head spin. You're involved in so many different things, and you've launched a lot of different organizations and what have you. As we wrap up today, could you pick one of those things that you're really passionate about and just tell us about it? I think I'd love to, and that's not self-driving cars related. I'd love to.
I was going to plug the Human Driving Association, which is my fun website which promotes human driving. We sell some cool T-shirts, but I'm proudest of my time working for an organization called the Moth, which is the largest storytelling organization, I think in the world. And working there for many years and traveling, meeting a lot of people, hearing a lot of stories and telling stories, influenced me greatly. So today I have an advisory firm called Johnson & Roy, where we advise on strategy and marketing primarily to robotics, AI, and self-driving companies. And the fundamental problem is, what story do you want to tell about your technology, and why would people want to hear it? And it's really fundamentally just one story. And this is, will this make my life better or make me freer? Yes or no?
Yeah.
It's better is easy to promise, but freer is a loaded term. I like to say that I'm pro-choice about automation and self-driving because it triggers something in everyone. Well, what do you mean by that? Because I want to be able to choose what technologies I use, where, when, and how. And I want my daughter to have that same choice. So I'm proudest of my time learning how to understand human psychology and trying to tell stories about technology that help people make better choices about what they want to pay for. Because our dollars are the ultimate vote.
Yeah. I can tell that's important to you. I've heard that theme kind of throughout. The way you're looking at the way people are thinking it, perceiving it. How does it play to their psychology? You've got a very pointed view on that. So that's been a fascinating thing to hear from you.
Is there anything dumber, worse, and more small-minded than people trying to sell the notion that you would own a humanoid robot that is in your house, that does your laundry anytime soon? I've got a Roomba, state of the art, 20-year-old technology now. I got a Roomba, and I don't trust this thing to do the job. I mean, it does a job, and it's good enough.
Yeah.
But once you start talking about replacing people, it triggers something, most of all in Americans, that goes deep and will never be defeated.
Well, Alex, it has been a really fascinating conversation. I feel like I've been fully educated on this sector, and I know 100% more than I knew before. So thank you for being on with us and just sharing your perspective on all these different aspects of self-driving cars. There are so many parallels between this sector and the one that I live in, with intelligent automation, software, robotics, and automating work that today is done by humans. And so we deal with a lot of the same topics and questions and ethics, because we're giving, our goal is to give humans the ability to do stuff that taps into their humanity, their uniquely human skills, versus punching data into a system all day long, mindless, repetitive work that is not really intended for humans. Unfortunately, there's still too much of that in every single company on the planet. So as you were talking about self-driving cars, I kept thinking about the world I'm in and our company's in. So it's been great just to get to know you and hear from you on this topic. Thank you so much for being here, and I wish you the best.
Thanks so much, Brad.